Hi, good afternoon. We're going to get started. Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Lenzner. I'm the Senior Vice President of Communications for Atlantic Media. And I'm here to welcome you today to the Atlantic Festival. It's our first day, so thank you all for coming out. It's our 10th year, and the festival's aim, for those who haven't attended before, is to explore the American idea and highlight the biggest issues of our time. Today we're going to discuss the changing dynamics of gender here in the nation's capital and explore what it means to be a woman in Washington. We're gathering on the cusp of what could be a gender revolution. A record number of women are running for office at every level of government, and more than 100 could be elected to the House this fall. Today we're going to explore that phenomenon. We're going to hear from a leader in Congress and talk about what it's like to be a woman defending the freedom of the press. For now, I'm going to welcome to the stage Jennifer Linker and Jeannie Mitchell. They're both Senior Directors of Federal Relations at ExxonMobil for brief remarks. And we want to thank them because for the last 8 years, ExxonMobil has been supporting us here at Women of Washington. Thanks, Jennifer and Jeannie.
Good afternoon. On behalf of ExxonMobil and the Vice President for Government Affairs of our DC office, Gant Walton, we'd like to welcome you to the 2018 Women of Washington event. We'd like to thank the Atlantic and the dynamic duo of Casey and Molly, as well as the other Atlantic team members that have helped organize today's event. We also like to thank Leader Pelosi for being here. We are honored that you have joined us and look forward to your discussion with Dana Bash. And we'd like to thank the other speakers participating in today's exciting event featuring politics and media. During these times, we are especially glad to be in a big tent of women.
Thanks, Jen. We'd also like to acknowledge our former colleague, Susan Carter, who is now president of the National Women's Party, president of the board of the National Women's Party, and we hope that you will join her and other festival attendees tonight at 6 p.m. for a wind down at the beautiful I'm going to get this wrong because it used to be Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument on Capitol Hill. So hope you will join Susan there. Since 2005, ExxonMobil and the ExxonMobil Foundation have helped women fulfill their economic potential. And we've helped them drive economic and social change in their communities through the Women's Economic Opportunity Initiative. To date, we've invested more than $80 million to help community-based and global partners implement programs directly benefiting tens of thousands of women in over 90 different countries. At ExxonMobil, we know that when women are empowered to move forward, the world moves with them. We look forward to the energy we will generate together in this 2018 Women of Washington event. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeannie. Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, now as we begin, we hope you'll silence your cell phones, but keep them close because we want you to tweet. You can tweet at AtlanticLIVE using the hashtag #TheAtlanticFest, or up here it says AtlanticWow. And with time permitting, we're hoping we can also allow you to ask a question or two after each conversation. And for those worried about making it in time to see Hillary Clinton at 2 o'clock, we promise we will finish in time so that you can get there and get a good seat. All right, but first, let's welcome House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi with CNN chief congressional correspondent Dana Bash.
Thank you so much. It's such a shame that there's nothing to talk about today. First of all, it's an honor to be here with all of you and you, Leader Pelosi. I want to just get right to it. I'm Brett Kavanaugh. You said, right? Why beat around the bush? You said over the weekend that if a woman ever performed the way Judge Kavanaugh did last week, she would be called hysterical.
Right.
I know what you meant. Most women know what you meant, but can you dissect that a little bit?
Well, first of all, thank you, Dana. It's nice to be with you and with all of you. It's so great to be in a room with so many women and some gentlemen as well. But it really is, because I'm used to being in Congress where the odds are so much the other way and that. But here's the thing. Let's just take a deep breath on all of this. There are two equities to be weighed in this: the respect for the integrity of the Supreme Court and respect for the message of a woman who has an allegation. Neither of those equities, in my view, have been advanced by the way of the Republican leadership of the Judiciary Committee conducted the proceedings. That may have given encouragement to Judge Kavanaugh to act in a manner, hysterical, the word stems from the same word as hysterectomy. It's a word that is identified with women being very emotional and the rest. So I chose that word very specifically. Mm-hmm. If a woman ever behaved that way. To me, it was behavior that was not suitable for a person who would be a judge on any court, much less the Supreme Court of the United States.
Do you think that behavior, the way he conducted himself, never mind the allegations, never even mind his positions, should be a factor when senators decide his fate?
Well, it certainly would be if it were a woman, that's for sure. But let's just say, let's go to the brighter side. They are going to have an investigation, and not a criminal investigation. This is a vetting. If any one of you were nominated for a federal position, you would be vetted by the FBI. So this is just a continuation of that vetting. And so I think this is not working? Now does it?
Better?
Should we start all over? Let's do that. So this is appropriate. So let's take it on the brighter side. We moved from where they were, thanks to Senator Flake and Senator Coons and others, Amy Klobuchar, some of the women on the committee as well, to a place where we will find more about the truth. But to your question, say this never came up. Say we didn't know that Judge Kavanaugh has written that essentially President Trump is above the law and shouldn't be bothered with any investigations. Say we didn't know what he had said about a woman's right to choose or health care or any of the other issues that are affected by decisions of the Supreme Court. Say we didn't, well, let's just leave it at that. What he said in his comments was not just that he was so emotional, but what he said about the Clintons, what did that have to do with anything? That he was getting political, it's just about you're not getting over the 2016 election. I think that behavior was beneath the dignity of the Supreme Court. The president gets elected, he chooses his court nominees. Senate has advice and consent, but you respect that the president won the election. But that doesn't mean that we undo the third branch of government, the judicial branch, because the president wants to stick with his appointee no matter what his behavior. I think on the basis of what he did the other day, he should recuse himself from many cases that will come before the court, whether it's the Supreme Court or the court he's on now.
Well, on that, you mentioned obviously it's the Senate that has the advise and consent role constitutionally, so you don't get a vote. but it is the House where impeachment proceedings begin, according to the Constitution. So if you take the House, will you move to impeach Brett Kavanaugh, either from the Supreme Court if he is confirmed, or from his current post on the federal bench?
As I said when I was asked this question last Friday, let's take it one day at a time. We're not about impeachment. When we win, which I anticipate we will do if it were today, but it's 5 weeks from today, but assuming nothing, but just saying in that possibility, we're not about dividing the country. We're about e pluribus unum. Our founders gave us guidance from many one. They couldn't imagine how many we would be or how different we would be from each other, but they knew that we should be one, and we have to find unity. So you'll see us coming forward with rules of the House that are about respect for other opinion, openness, accountability, fairness, and unity.
But do you see anything?
Our purpose is for the people to lower their health care costs by reducing the cost of prescription drugs, by bigger paychecks, by building the infrastructure of America, and by better government, by reducing the role of big, dark, special interest money in politics. That is our purpose. Hopefully this will work its way through the process with the truth being made known, and the truth will set us free. But it is not that people care about what happens to them in their lives. They see the cost of prescription drugs and healthcare costs. They see a paycheck that doesn't go as far as it should. They doubt whether their voice counts for much because big special interest money weighing in. Would we ever get a gun bill with a gun lobby? Will we ever get a raise in the minimum wage? Will we ever protect the air our children breathe? All those things are more important to people than who's on the Supreme Court. Although it has ramifications in their lives, they don't see it as immediately as some of these other issues. So we're about unifying, not dividing. Let the process work its will.
So let's focus then on
So that would not be my plan.
It would not be your plan to
I'm not about
impeach or-
impeachment. I have enough people on my back to impeach the president. Now we're going to talk about somebody. It's about unifying, and let's hope that again, with the information that comes forward and with the demonstration of temperament that is not judicial, that the Senate will do the right thing.
Can I just ask you, you mentioned that you have enough people on your back who want to impeach the president. Is your reluctance to say, I'm not even going to talk about impeachment even for Brett Kavanaugh, because just you are politically astute, to say the least, and you understand it ignites the Republicans, or you genuinely think it's too soon, or a combination?
I think that politics has nothing to do with it. We shouldn't impeach for a political purpose, but we should not be reluctant to impeach if there's a case to be made. Mm-hmm. So it's not about politics. It's about the facts and the law.
So let's talk more broadly about the fact that the midterms are 5 weeks from today. How do you see the issues that have come up in such an, as you put it before, a caffeinated way, playing into your main political goal now, which is retaking the House?
Well, what is working for us is our for the people. Again, healthcare costs in the country, that's probably the major issue. And it's tied to what the president and the Republicans did on the tax bill. Because what the tax bill did, in addition to being totally unfair and giving 83% of the benefits to the top 1%, taking us deeply in debt to the tune of at least $2 trillion, also had the effect of saying then, the president saying, we have to make cuts. So that'll be $2 trillion in Medicare and Medicaid. It's also about the cost of prescription drugs. And so people are concerned about their own personal financial stability. And that is the connection, listening to people about their concerns, how they see things. That's what our candidates are about. And we think we're going to win because we have the A team on the field. These people know their why. They know why they're running. They have a vision about our country that takes us into the future in a responsible way. They know what their subjects are. If it happens to be climate, it happens to be guns, it happens to be LGBT, women's right to choose, and you name the subject, they know what is their motivation, and they know how to get things done by listening to their constituents, because they will each be an independent representative of their district. And that means that the word representative is their job description as well as their job title. So it's pretty exciting to see how they are taking off across the country. We have 83 red to blue. You know what that means, red to blue. 43 of them are women candidates, and they are just spectacular. We have enough women to win the House with just women alone, even more to have a bigger majority, and of course we want the full mix in that victory. If I just may add this, though, we talk about the issues, we talk about the candidates, the politics, and the rest. It's really important for people to, and this is something that I've been talking about as I travel the country. Our founders, they just were magnificent in so many ways. Our founding documents, thank God they made them amendable so that we could expand freedom over the years. But they had the preamble to the Constitution, which stated our purpose as a nation, and therefore putting forth this Constitution. And the first two words after the preamble are Article 1, next, the legislative branch. The first branch of government, a co-equal branch of government. And in this election, the balance of power, the separation of power, the check on the executive is a very big issue. So when we win, God willing, well, I'm not supposed to pray for a victory, but God willing. That wasn't really a prayer, it was sort of a God willing.
Figure of speech.
Figure of speech. It was... we'll be able to show Article 1, this is not a rubber stamp for any president, but its own independent, co-equal branch of government. And these candidates bring that commitment, honoring the vows of our founders, the sacrifice of our men and women in uniform, the aspiration of our children to their candidacies, and they will bring them to the Congress of the United States. Article 1.
So I want to just sort of hone in on one thing. You talked about the issues that candidates of both genders and of all genders have been talking about for months and months and months before Brett Kavanaugh was nominated. And you just laid them out here. But you also talked about all these women running, and we remember what happened in 1992, the year of the woman. And I mean, talk about how the cultural moment that we're in, that everybody is talking about, plays into that. Do you think that there are obviously probable pluses for female candidates, but do you see any potential backlash?
Well, I do think that from a standpoint of backlash, one of the purposes of President Trump and his statements, his tweets, and his nominations is to undo the MeToo movement or any other manifestations of it, to weaken that. And as I say, we have to have balance, we have to have due process. That only strengthens the word of a woman rather than just saying, she said it, so that's it. No, let's have due process. Let's have this investigation. But across the country, I don't think people realize how pervasive some of this, shall we say, Me Too moments, for any other phrase you want to use, has been in our society. And women know. And women, as you see in the polls, if you believe polls, are overwhelmingly opposed to the Kavanaugh nomination. Not all women, but overwhelmingly women are opposed. So let's take this to a brighter side. I don't want Kavanaugh, as important as it is in terms of separation of power, and he says the president's above the law, a woman's right to choose, how hard that fight was, and now it could be overturned. I don't think there's any question if he gets nominated. The president said it's a done deed. So they either overturn it or send it to the states, which will undo it in another way. But this is the same Congress that we're electing people to, and in the course of this Congress, we will observe the 100th anniversary of women having the right to vote. It's such a remarkable thing that this Congress will have so many more women members to make their mark. And as I heard some of the comments about when women advance, so we have an expression, when women succeed, America succeeds. And that means in every aspect, government, politics, the media, the military, the private sector, the academic world. This is essential. And I say to women, know your power. There's nobody like you. Go out there. Follow your passion. Know your stuff. Connect with people, because nothing is more wholesome to any system than the increased participation of women. And I do know this as a fact. Everything else might be an opinion. As a fact, if you reduce the role of money in politics and increase the level of civility, we'll have many more women in elective office and in leadership.
And I want to get to a couple more issues, but before I do, take your political hat off if you can. And I just want to ask this question just in terms of you being the highest ranking woman in elected office who got where you were. You've gotten where you are by excelling in a man's world. So talk about this moment that we're seeing with the testimony last week with Professor Ford and women just coming out and bearing their souls to their friends, to their family. How is that for you to see and maybe even experience with people you know, given the world that you have been living in and working in for all these years?
Well, let me just say, a number of years ago, more than 20, I was asked to have a reception at my home for Anita Hill for a charity that she was the new School of Law in San Francisco, and she was a special guest. I didn't know Anita Hill. I mean, of course, I respected and admired her, but I didn't know her. So when we had the event at our home as a fundraiser for the school, it was overwhelming, the number of people who came. But what was interesting to me is I had never seen them at any events before. But they were my friends. They were people that I know that were in carpool and class mom and carve the pumpkins and do the picnic and all that from school with my 5 kids. I knew a lot of moms. So when they came, I was like, well, it's so nice that you're here. And these women, never went to a political event. They probably were Republicans for all I know. I don't know. But they told me their stories. They said, you don't know this about me, but I had this experience. And it was so interesting to me because I did not have, I don't know, maybe I was oblivious. I wasn't aware of how pervasive it all was. And I think it's when last year, when it all started, this burst of acknowledgement of what was going on, the calls that I got constantly from women that I knew, and they told me what happened to them 20 years ago. So the fact that this happened a long time ago, these assaults have a lifetime impact. And now this person, who may or may not be guilty of this, wants a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. It really needs attention.
This is going to be a hard turn, but I'm going to do it because we're limited in time. You have another thing that's going to be on your plate, potentially, and that is a new trade deal that the president announced yesterday with Mexico and Canada to replace NAFTA. The president campaigned on this. He says he's delivering on it, but it's going to be up to you all in Congress. What do you think?
Well, we have
Yes
to
or no?
see the agreement, and the president has a way of saying no NAFTA and then putting forth something that's very much like NAFTA. And so how different is it? Any trade agreement has to increase the paycheck of Americans' workers, protect our environment, create growth in our country without diminishing people in other countries as well. So we'll have to see. And the most important, what I would say, the most important part of it all is what are the enforcement mechanisms in the agreement? The president has already said that he picked up some of the improvements that are in NAFTA from TPP. So I don't know where he's going with this. But the whole thing, let's hope for the best. Let's see what it is. We probably won't vote on this until February or March. Mm-hmm. This is a long way off. But the China issue still looms large. And see, here's the thing. When I've been fighting China on trade for over 25 years, human rights violations, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, lack of access to their markets, violations of intellectual property and the rest. But and that's the big hit on it's a $525 billion of products coming into U.S., 125 billion going out. It's about a 400 billion difference in the trade relationship. The Chinese were also exploiting the EU. So I would have thought the president would have joined with the EU, increased our leverage vis-a-vis our negotiations with China. Instead, he alienated the EU to the glee of the Chinese. So this whole issue has to be seen in how does it all come down for American workers while lifting up people in the rest of the world? How does it come down for protecting our environment, because the connection between commerce and the environment is a very direct one. So we'll view it on its own, but what it does in terms of leverage or not vis-a-vis the big trade debate that we have, and that is a U.S.-China trade.
And this is a deep one before we kick it out to the audience, but I'm just curious about your take on the president, I'm talking about North Korea now, the president saying he fell in love with Kim Jong-un when the two met, and that Kim has written him beautiful letters.
Well, one would have to wonder about the president's takes. He's crazy about Putin, really crazy about Putin. He has good things to say about the thug who is the president of the Philippines. He says President Xi of China, who's one of the most repressive leaders in China, and in violation of human rights all over the place, and with the Uyghurs, with the Tibetans, with just people in Beijing, Hong Kong, and the rest. He thinks he's a great guy. But just looking at
But you think it's okay for him to be talking to Kim Jong-un, right?
I think you always talk. Jaw, better than war. But to say he's in love with him, and by the way, within the same 24-hour period where the administration has said that any diplomats who come to the United States will be, their significant other, their partner, would not be granted a visa unless they were married. Now, many of them live in countries where they can't get married. But how do you do that? I mean, are we talking love here? Or what does love mean? But the president has a tendency, people kind of love people sort of like themselves. And you know what I'm saying? But by no means is he the villain that Kim Jong-un is. But Kim Jong-un, he's killed his own family members. He's a repressive tyrant, and he fell in love with him. You have to question his taste.
Okay, before we kick it out, have you seen this? Yeah. So,
see, it told me the night before it was coming out the next day.
Well, the reason I brought it is because it was last month, and this is the very first time you were ever on the cover of Time magazine, and I want to know, I've been dying to know, did anybody there tell you why it took so long?
No, but, as I say, I have my focus where it needs to be. Right now, it's winning the election in 5 weeks so that we can protect all that we care about.
Audience questions?
It is interesting, though, since you're waiting for a question, that a woman would be elected the Speaker of the House, even though they probably know how powerful the Speaker of the House is. President, Vice President, Speaker of the House. President Bush used to call me number 3. He was 1, Cheney was 2, I was 3. So it's awesomely powerful position. It's a constitutional position, and they did not recognize that. I don't say that in my own interest because I really don't care. But I do think from the standpoint of recognizing the opportunities, the power, the example that it would be for other women, that they probably are a little late.
Oh.
Who cares?
Hello, my name is Sharon Bovat. I'm Voice of a Moderate. And a lot of people would like to know what about Afghanistan? We're spending so much money in Afghanistan. People in the next presidential election will not have been born, could vote, that will not have been born when we started the war in Afghanistan. So I know you have so many issues with Kavanaugh's yearbook, but could we talk about the exit strategy with Afghanistan or anything about that issue? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your question. I've been to Afghanistan many, many times. The initiation of hostilities in Afghanistan was a justified thing because that had been a safe harbor to the people who, well, perpetrated the crime, the atrocity on our country. However, my concern about Afghanistan is when we went into Afghanistan, we did not defeat the Taliban, we routed them. They headed for the hills. And what did we do? We went to Iraq. And I think that that was a major mistake for our country. So now then we're engaged in 2 wars at once, 2 unpaid for wars. And the war in Iraq, I think, has to be. Now, I was Adam Schiff at that time. I was the ranking member on intelligence. And I can tell you that the intelligence did not support the threat that the administration was describing in Iraq in terms of weapons of mass destruction. The press said to me, "Are you calling the president a liar?" I said, "No, I'm just stating a fact." So we went to Iraq, got engaged in that war. So many people, lives lost, both American and Iraqi, all the rest, at the same time neglecting what was happening in Afghanistan. It might interest you to know there were very few boots on the ground in Afghanistan, fewer than a few hundred. So it wasn't a major effort to get rid of the Taliban, and we're living with all the consequences. We made a special effort to make sure that when the Taliban is doing what it's doing now, that we would not undermine the progress that had been made for women in Afghanistan. This is very, very important to us. Laura Bush, Mrs. George W. Bush, Laura Bush, a champion on this issue, Michelle Obama, and the rest about women in Afghanistan. And right now, the situation, I don't see a clear path out, as you talk about the exit strategy, but we should have some idea of our path out when we go in. And when we went in, we should have done our business, finished it off, but not use Iraq as an excuse to take our attention away from Afghanistan. So I appreciate your interest in it. It's a very serious in terms of the commitment of our men and women in uniform, our prospects for success there, and it deserves all the attention that you are giving it.
Madam Leader, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Got it?
Thank you, Leader Pelosi. Thanks, Dana. We're going to turn the conversation now to women running for elected office. And for that conversation, we have Amy Walter, National Editor of Cook Political Report, Susanna Welford, President and founder of Running Start. Here's Amy. And Jen Higgins, co-chair Right Now Women PAC. And leading the conversation is The Atlantic's Priscilla Alvarez.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I want to kick off this discussion with a statistic. According to the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers University, 235 women won House nominations. That's up from 167 in 2016. 22 women won Senate primaries. That's up from 18 in 2012. So I want to ask each of you, is this attributable to the Trump presidency? And would we see this strong a presence had Hillary Clinton won the White House? Go ahead, Susanna.
Oh, because I clearly have thoughts on this. I actually have been thinking ever since Hillary lost that absolutely, if she had won, people would think, well, we did it. Women have gotten to the highest place, and there we are, and the problem is solved. And in fact, the problem wouldn't have been solved, but the attention on getting women into positions of power would really have dissipated, I think. So yes, I do think that whether it's a reaction to Trump or whether it's just a, wow, we thought this woman was so close and she didn't get it, I really do think that that election is why we have what we have today.
Amy?
Yeah, and there was a sense, I think, among a lot of women who might not have been crazy about Hillary Clinton, weren't really enthusiastic necessarily about her as a candidate, but were very surprised by the results. I think you're seeing an engagement or maybe a re-engagement of those women as voters, as donors, some of them as candidates. But I also think that the Trump presidency did show for a lot of people that, someone who's never been in politics before, granted, he had kind of pretty good name ID for being on TV a lot, but you don't have to be an expert to do this. And the challenge that women have long had, and you guys know this talking to women candidates, I always feel like unless they know all the answers, unless they've gone through all the steps, unless they can answer the question on Afghanistan within, the first 10 minutes of announcing their candidacy, they shouldn't run. And I think what the 2016 candidacy did for a lot of these women was they said, I don't have time to get up to speed on this. This is an emergency. I'm going to jump in feet first, and if I make it, I make it, and if not, I know that I'll have done my job.
Jen?
Yeah, I think to some extent, being a Republican and seeing some of the shifts on the Republican side, what we found is that a lot of the stats that you quoted were almost very majority Democrat women. I think there's really been a resurgence in motivation and intensity on the Democratic side that we haven't seen on the Republican side. We can attribute that maybe to President Trump as well. But I agree with Amy to the extent that we look at sort of the environment and how women view running for office. I think one of the things that stands out to me is that I think to some extent because of the Donald Trump presidency, you have women saying, well, if he can do it, I should be able to do it, right? Like anyone can do it, and I need to put my time in, I need to come to Washington and decide I'm going to run for office. And so to some extent, you're seeing more of a motivating factor because, anything's possible, but also because these women know that they're going to have the resources to support them, and maybe that's not necessarily the case on the Republican side.
And I think it's generational, too. This is, I sat down with a whole bunch of House candidates a couple months ago, and this made me feel really old that every single one of them was under the age of 40. These are women who are used to just doing stuff. They're not caught in the generational challenge that some older women and other generations have had. A lot of them have kids. That hasn't been this factor that in years previous had stopped women from running for office. So I think that's another piece to understand about this, that these are in many ways first-time candidates, but this is the millennial / younger Gen X women who are coming into their own.
And that actually leads into my next question, which is to what degree are women emphasizing their role as mothers in their campaign ads? We see this quite often where they have the children in the back of the minivan. Yeah. And so how often are you seeing them really latch on to that, Amy, since you spoke to candidates?
I think that all candidates like to show that there's a human piece of them somewhere in there. They're not just a robot on policy issues. But I think what a lot of these women are emphasizing is what the stereotypes of women are actually working to their benefit this time, which is, look, men complain, women get stuff done, okay? Like, who has the to-do list in the family? We know who that is. By the way, it's not me. I do terrible on to-do lists. But for the most part, it's like, I've already done 67 things today, so fine, I put running for Congress on that too, whatever. It's not that hard. Right after I clean up whatever the dog threw up and, I was late to work, and so I think that is what is actually working to help women this time. Now, what I worry about, of course, is we continue to label these as it's the year of the woman. It's a year that was spurred by Donald Trump. This is all about women getting angry. To me, I know we'll reach a pinnacle when it's actually not a big deal to have women running. Like, we're like, yeah, okay, a bunch of women are running for Congress. It's no big deal.
And Susanna, your organization actually helps encourage and train young women to run for political office. So how are you convincing them to run for office, and has that approach changed over the last few years?
You know, it's interesting. It hasn't changed that much. So we have a very unusual niche. We are actually training high school and college-age women to see themselves as political leaders. So not behind the scenes, not voters or even donors, but we want them to be the ones who run for office. You know, since the very beginning, we're now 12 years old, they didn't need convincing. I mean, that's the fascinating thing, that we get huge numbers of young women in our programs, and they understand why they need our training. They understand why they should be at these highest levels of power, because there aren't people like them who are in power, who are representing their issues. So I think that they are more riled up after the election, but I think that it's been fascinating to me ever since I started that this has just been like teenagers, they get it.
Yeah.
And to follow up on that, are there skills that you're teaching them that women need to have in particular to run for office?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes to what Amy said a little bit, that I think if we all imagine what the typical politician is, or the typical political speech, it's not great, right? I mean, it's the policy robot. I know they sometimes the men will have their wife there, or they'll try to humanize, but I think politics has not ever been known for its authentic candidates. And so the big thing that we're telling our women is we really think authenticity sells. And the women who come through Running Start, they tend to be, well, they're really young, and they tend to be incredibly diverse, both in racially, socioeconomically, and party as well. And so we tell them, look, you know, you're not going to look like the typical candidate no matter what. So why don't you just run as yourself, and let's see how it goes. And then you look at like Ilhan Omar running in Minnesota, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, both really young women who look so much different than candidates are supposed to look, and they're killing it. So that's really our big message.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's great, and I'm a board member of Running Start, in full disclosure, I think one of the great things about Running Start that I think we see amongst younger women that are considering running or considering becoming candidates for local, state, and federal office is this interest in wanting to work across party lines and to not view themselves as partisans that only talk to partisans. And I think one of the great things about Running Start and some of the programming they offer for high school and college age kids is getting young women at an early age to recognize that it's okay to talk to a Democrat, it's okay to talk to a Republican, because we're building those bridges now so that we hopefully have not only more informed candidates and more informed members of Congress, these females that are going to be part of the House and the Senate, but we have candidates that are prepared to say, you know, I really want to work with you on an issue, not say I need to do exactly what my party's telling me to do.
And Jen, you mentioned this at the top, but the majority of the candidates that are the women candidates that are winning their nominations are Democrats, and we're seeing that white college-educated women are also moving toward the Democratic Party. So what are some bright spots that you see for Republicans in 2018, and is it possible that Republican women will match that number in the years to come?
I'm going to be real, probably not in terms of the Republican side. In terms of matching the intensity, I have to be honest. I think this is a down year for Republican women. We've seen a lot of turnover in the House and the Senate. Some of these women who have chosen not to run have ran for higher office, like Kristi Noem in South Dakota, Marsha Blackburn in Tennessee, which is positive for the party to have these women that were in the House running for statewide office. But it does leave us with a drain in the House and the Senate in terms of the number of candidates members of Congress, that we have on the women's side. So I think that's not a positive. I think we could actually be in a position where we're at the lowest number of Republican women that we've had in U.S. Congress in a very long time. I think back to the Reagan years. In the Reagan years, we had 25 women in Congress. Half of them, I guess it's not an even number, but half of them were Democrats and half of them were Republicans. And now we're in an environment where you're going to have 100+ women in Congress, and the vast, vast majority of them are going to be Democrats. I don't know that that's good for party parity, but I do think it's helping to sort of continue to see that gender gap dividing in terms of the number of Republicans who are women, who are in Congress, who are seeing people like themselves in party power and want to run for office.
Right. Do you think this changes at all at the state legislature?
I think what's interesting to me is that you have so many red states and you have so many legislators at the state level who are eager to sort of move up the chain and to move into federal office. I'm not sure that this is the cycle that they're focused on. I think maybe in 2020 with the president at the top of the ticket, you're likely to see many more of those Republican women running from statewide office to national office.
Yeah.
Something that's discussed at length is, as we talk about the Year of the Women, we also think back to Anita Hill and to 1992. But this year, and 2017, 2016, we had the Women's March, we have the MeToo movement now, and now we have this uptick in women running for office. Would you call this a moment, or is it a movement?
I just really hope it's a movement. I really do. And I was sharing earlier that when Me Too first appeared, I was cynical about it. I thought that we would have this talk about it for maybe a month. In fact, I was writing an article and I remember thinking, I have to finish this really quickly because probably next week nobody will care about this. And how many months ago was that? It was such a long time ago, and things are only becoming more intense. So I think displaced groups, which women are, they get to a point where they say, you know what? Seriously, there's enough evidence that things need to be different. And I really firmly think that we are at such a movement. And the work that I'm doing with Running Start with the young women, I'm trying to make sure that this movement has real longevity by starting with high school girls who are going to know that they should run. And so we'll keep it going.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really important especially to see what the election results are, where women have been successful and where women voters have been pivotal. We spend a lot of time talking about suburban women, especially college-educated women and professional suburban districts. They are a key component to this election for Democrats, there's no doubt. But if that's all that this election provides is that group of voters turned out, and maybe they turned out enough to bring Democrats in the majority, but you're still not seeing voters of color turn out. Yeah. You're still not seeing white working class women who are open to voting for Democrats, but who aren't turning out and voting. It suggests that this is a movement that is really still siloed among a very privileged group of women, and I think that's why what happened with Ocasio-Cortez and a number of other women of color who've been successful in some of these primaries has been very important. Their voices, once they come to Congress, will also be very important to see that this maybe moves in a different direction. Not that we're not talking about it, but we're moving the spotlight from this one group of women to other displaced groups. Yeah.
One of the things I would add is that I think you're seeing a movement and an intensity amongst women and amongst Americans to get things done. They want to see Congress work. They want to see government work for them. And I think part of this is I wouldn't say the jury's out, but I think to some extent you'll know whether this is a movement or a blip if you see that these women come to Washington and they're able to advance an agenda on childcare, on paid leave, on economic security, on the issues that matter to working families. And I think if you're able to see that, then that's going to prompt and motivate other women to come here and say, you know what, I came here and I made a difference. I didn't just come here and sit in an office for 2 years and get frustrated like everyone else. I came here and I moved the needle, and that's what they are expecting to do because, to Amy's point, they're coming here to get things done. They're not coming here to be here.
Yep, that's exactly right.
And I'm actually going to open it up to questions.
Good afternoon. I'm Courtney Turner, and I have a real penchant for action, so I'm excited to hear what you have to say, but talk is cheap. So, what specific steps or advice do you have for us, or what appeal would you make to the everyday citizen to get out there and vote? No matter what your politics are, stop talking, use your voice, go vote. So how would you push that, please?
I think you just did it. I was going to say.
I think so
was like,
too.
That's a pretty good pitch, to be honest with you. I do think that to some extent there's a need to make sure that people are educated, that they know how they feel about positions, they know how they feel about their member of Congress. There's some accountability. There are a lot of different websites and groups out there that are able to provide information on what your member of Congress has done or hasn't done. Be informed as you consider that, and make sure that you know that your vote does matter.
And I would just add, voting is so incredibly important, and everybody should vote. But I think also when we see a problem that we want solved, it's important to realize, we live in America. Every single one of us has the ability to run for office, to actually solve that problem. And I think that let's all vote, but let's just remember that we have that other opportunity as well.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, my name's Roxy. My question is more so about the kind of Gen Z focus and the millennial focus. You guys talked a lot about how you're helping Gen Z kind of prepare to run for office, but what advice do you have for the millennials who are kind of like facing that corporate America struggle right now that aspire to run for office one day? Like, how would you advise them to go about getting mentorship or kind of getting advice to focus on that, because the focus seems to be more on Gen Z?
I mean, I obviously have a lot to say about this. I mean, I think that you should go to as many networking events or events like this as you possibly can, and have a little elevator speech about yourself, about what you're passionate about, and about what you want people to know about you, and then talk to everybody. And that includes your Uber driver and the person who does your nails. But make sure you make a name for yourself. And that, I think, is one of the fastest ways to sort of lay that groundwork. So people are like, right, I know Amy. I know exactly what she stands for. And that's one of the stepping stones to running.
One of the things I would add to that is, I think what I learned about being in Washington, especially being involved in politics, is that no one has one set resume or career path to get to office. And I think a lot of times, especially living inside the Beltway, we see, oh, that guy was a lawyer, or that woman was a professor, or she worked in the corporate environment for a number of years and then decided to get into state politics or local politics. There's no one set path to running for office. So I think take hold of diverse experiences professionally, learn more about the issues that you care about, be passionate about something, and use that as your motivation to advance your network and build a strategy for running down the line.
And I just have one more question for Amy. As we think about the next step, if women are elected, will there be policy changes on the Hill?
A lot of that's going to depend on who's sitting in the positions of power, who's sitting at the table making those decisions. But let's be really clear. No matter what happens, right? If Democrats, they take the House, maybe they take the Senate, there's still a Republican in the White House. So whatever agenda you want to put forward, you have to be realistic about this as a brand new member. Now remember, there are a lot of 2010 Republicans who came in with the same fervor about, we're going to come in, we're going to make change, we're angry about Obama and Democrats, and they got here and they realized it's a lot harder than it looks, and the frustration built and built and built and built, and then when they finally got a chance to do the one thing they said they'd always want to do, which is repeal Obamacare, they were unable to do that. So I think the real focus for a lot of the folks who are coming in here is to be realistic and what you can do in your first 2 years, understand how the process works, and then bring home something. What is it that you think is super important, and how can you use this position that you have to make sure that you're getting something done on it every day? So,
all right, we're out of time. Thank you for
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh my God, it's so hot.
Okay, last but not least, we're going to hear from some women in the media. Joining us now is Alex Wagner, contributing editor at The Atlantic, Susan Page, Washington bureau chief at USA Today, and joining them is Atlantic editor Adrienne LaFrance.
Hello. Ooh, sorry. Hi. Thanks, everyone, for being here, and especially to my fellow panelists. I wanted to start, we were actually just talking about this backstage, but this sort of profound sense of deja vu that I know some of us are feeling, and maybe Susan, you can speak to this first as someone who covered the Anita Hill proceedings.
Hi, it's great to be here. So in 1991, I was a White House correspondent for Newsday, and I was covering the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings. And what struck me in the past week is how precisely the same things are 27 years later. You had testimony by a professional woman, credible testimony, compelling for a lot of people, and when she finished, you had the Supreme Court nominee come in and be extremely forceful, even though Judge Kavanaugh hadn't betrayed that kind of personality in his previous hearings. It was very much like the Clarence Thomas playbook, and it turned the sentiment, it certainly rallied his supporters in a way that was immediate and forceful, and I think puts him back on a track for prospective confirmation by the end of the week.
How about you, Alex?
I was not covering the Hill-Thomas battle, but I co-host a show, a political documentary series called The Circus, and we devoted, as everyone has, a fair amount of time looking back and seeing what the common threads were. And I concur with everything Susan said, but at the same time, I think this moment is different for women, in large part because the MeToo movement has sort of laid a foundation of, I think, fluency in and around the issues relating to sexual predation and harassment and assault. In a way, I mean, you look back at those Anita Hill tapes, people didn't know what sexual harassment was, right? This moment is coming at the tail end, or I'm not sure where it is on the trajectory, but it's in the middle of a movement where giants, titans of industries have been taken down. We're in what feels like a reckoning about gender and power in this country. And so in that way, I think the stakes, what happens to the country after this thing is all over, the stakes are higher, and they're certainly different than they were in the era of Clarence Thomas.
Well, and it also feels, so as journalists, we're thinking about a couple of different ways to interpret the stakes here, right? So there's the judicial stakes, like what's the outcome for the Supreme Court, the cultural stakes, so this whole sort of backdrop against which this thing is playing out, the MeToo movement, a year since the first widely known allegations against Harvey Weinstein, and then the journalistic stakes, which I think are really, of course, I think they're really complicated and challenging. But I wonder, now that we're in this moment where Me Too is being sort of seen along partisan lines, how does that affect our ability as journalists to credibly tell accurate stories about sexual abuse? Especially at a time when the institution of American journalism is being questioned in the halls of power, is the fact that Me Too is increasingly being seen as partisan journalistically problematic?
Yeah, I think Leader Pelosi was just up here saying they're trying to end the Me Too movement. When you think back to the person that sort of kicked this off nationally, Tarana Burke founded the movement, but when we think about the sort of more contemporary iteration of it, Harvey Weinstein was a Democratic donor, right?
And the New York
that
Times
was meaningful, I think.
Must have considered that too, and they were
well, and if
publishing
you
it.
remember in the first flush of reports about that, there was a lot of focus on here's someone who donated to the Clinton campaign, and there was a lot of sort of, at least from the right, some sort of there was an attempt to draw some lines there. I don't think that was ultimately successful, but I do think it was meaningful that the first notable man to see his fortunes fail in the wake of these scandals was a Democrat, right? And that, in some way, it felt like it was going to insulate the movement from the cry of partisanship. We are in a different place right now. I think one of the things liberals, Democrats, and analysts perhaps have failed to do in this moment is, as the allegations that this is a coordinated Democratic smear campaign against one of President Trump's judicial nominees, as those allegations have been made, there's been very little pushback to say, well, what about Neil Gorsuch? Same prep school, judicial nominee, President Trump. Nothing. There was no conjuring of allegations in that event. I think some of that there could have been more of a response, perhaps, to sort of quell the partisan cries in and around this nomination. But as journalists, I think any time partisanship is injected into a news story, it makes it more complicated to cover. I think that shouldn't make us shy away from covering something. But I think it makes it trickier. That was such a boring answer to your question.
No, that was not boring at all.
I don't think this is the Me Too movement is naturally partisan. I think it's become partisan with the Supreme Court fight, and to some degree I think it is exacerbating a political divide in the country where the Democratic Party is becoming increasingly female and the Republican Party is becoming increasingly male. And I think you've definitely seen that in the backlash to the accusations against Judge Kavanaugh. It's very male.
Yeah. Well, and after the midterms, the Republican caucus is likely to be more white, more male, and the Democratic caucus is likely to be more female and more multicultural. So the natural trend lines create factionalism.
And I think not a good thing.
Yeah. Well, that there's that divide, yeah.
Well, and Alex, you talked about the sort of more advanced sense of fluency around talking about these issues, sexual assault, and I wonder the extent to which either of you think that the sort of improved gender balance in newsrooms has affected the way this story is being covered across the board. I mean, do you notice a difference compared with the Anita Hill moments?
Absolutely. I think the fact that there are so many more women in journalism and in position of power in journalism makes a big difference. I'm female, you may have noticed, and Bureau Chief of USA Today. My boss, the managing editor, is female, Kristen Del Guzzi. Her boss, the editor-in-chief, is female, Nicole Carroll. Her boss, the publisher, is Maribel Perez, is also female.
And that's still really rare, we should point out.
I was going to say, like, kudos to your newsroom.
So it's rare, but it is actually happening across the industry, and I think it increases the kind of sophistication in hearing accusations and being able to assess them and write about them.
I think that it's great that we're seeing more women, more diversity in newsrooms, but generally speaking, I think the upper echelons of who's commissioning stories and who's really running things remains decidedly white, decidedly male. And then part of me, just because, like, why not just always be dissatisfied even with all progress, is, I think it would be a good day when these weren't seen as women's issues that need to be covered by women, right? I would like some more gender parity as far as coverage of.
I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to ask, this is something that comes up often in my Twitter mentions, but also just generally this sort of claim that any time that you're featuring a woman's perspective journalistically that you're somehow falling into identity politics. And it's true, some people's identity involves the fact that they are women. But I wonder how you think about that as sort of another sort of galvanizing line in the ever more partisan sort of public sphere that we have.
Well, I mean, I do think, look, there is something. It's not that women shouldn't be covering the stories of sexual assault and talking to victims of sexual assault. It just shouldn't be exclusively seen as like the purview of women and like the province of like where women can write and talk to other women. And I think there's still a little bit of that. I mean, I think we're getting better, but I also think that when other women are interviewing victims of sexual assault, there is sometimes, not always, but there's a quality of empathy that I think women understand when you talk about. I mean, when Christine Blasey Ford talked about the uproarious laughter of allegedly Brett Kavanaugh and Mark Judge in that room, I think women and people who have been powerless in society and culture for a long period of time, that struck their hearts, right? There was a sense of like deep emotional empathy in that moment. You know what it's like to be humiliated, to feel like you have no exit. And I think that sometimes, again, not always, in these kinds of conversations and interviews, women can sometimes bring an understanding of that to the table as journalists that it's not, again, it's not exclusive to women, but I think there is something to be said for that. And so I think it's good when women can participate in the process.
The presence of women makes a difference every step of the way. It made a difference that there were only male senators on the Republican side doing questioning, and it made a difference that this time, unlike in 1991, there were 4 female senators on the Democratic side. And I think you can't underestimate the kind of difference that makes in the short term and over the long term.
We're going to go to questions shortly, so be thinking about your questions. But before we do, one more question I had for you guys is, I'm trying to say you guys less frequently. We had an Atlantic piece recently about how
y'all.
I can't do y'all. I can't do it. But the question I had was about this. There's sort of this rallying cry now of believe women. And as a journalist, I find that to be, I understand the spirit with which it's offered, but it goes against what we're trained as journalists.
Yeah.
I mean, we believe no one, right?
As a journalist, you have to ask yourself, is the inverse true? If there are men walking around with signs that said believe men.
Sure, exactly. It would be seen as
blanket
ridiculous.
belief of anyone without any further investigation is something we shouldn't advocate.
So I wonder, and you see, I do think that there is some extent to which, especially among younger journalists, you see sort of acceptance of these kinds of ideas as separate from the work of journalism. And I wonder what you've seen in your newsrooms and sort of just for your perspective on that.
You know, I think there's more of a willingness not to disbelieve women when they make charges, but they don't have corroboration. But I think as journalists, you have the same responsibility for confirmation that you have in any other story. You know, there's a journalistic truism that is, if your mother says she loves you, get a second source. And that and that applies in these stories as well as in others. But what I think used to happen is there was an automatic willingness to disbelieve women who didn't file a police report, for instance, or who couldn't say the next day I told my best friend. Now there is a willingness to accept that as worthy of inquiry, but I don't think it eliminates the need to find corroboration anywhere you can.
Yeah, that slogan appears, it feels born of a desire to course correct, right? We've disbelieved women for so long, now is the time to believe them. But I do think there's a difference between advocacy and journalism and opinion analysis and, reporting, and there's space for everybody. But I think as a rule, as journalists, our job is to ask questions, and I think we need to sort of rethink what we believe to be credible and not credible, especially in this moment. But I think blanket sort of doubt giving is not what we're in the business of doing.
Great. All right. Questions?
Okay. My name is Ann Bell, and I'm with USP, but this is totally unrelated to my professional work. But I have a bit of a problem with the focus on the discussion about the Kavanaugh hearing about being Me Too. Because I don't think it really is it shouldn't be focused on the Me Too. I think that loses the point. It's the focus that should be on revealing the white male privilege. And that's what needs to change, whether it's diversity in terms of race or socioeconomic or women. So the question is less how to make coverage of these type of issues that focus women less partisan in terms of party, but less permissive of white male privilege. Does that make sense?
I think, look, I just go back to what Lindsey Graham said the day of that hearing. He said, I'm a white single man from South Carolina, and I've been told to shut up. Well, I will not shut up. So when you talk about going after the patriarchy and white male privilege, I don't know that that's a sentiment shared equally across party lines, right? I think part of the indignation that you're seeing on certain corners of the right is the idea that you would go after a well-educated, accomplished white man with these quote-unquote smears. I do think about, as it concerns the Kavanaugh confirmation specifically, the lens has widened. We are now not just talking about Christine Blasey Ford's allegations. We're talking about his behavior when inebriated, whether he perjured himself, his truthfulness generally under oath. It is expanded to something that I think is much more about preserving the integrity of the Supreme Court and the Senate and institutional credibility than it is really even about Me Too at this present moment, at least this week, it feels to me.
Other questions? We have time for one more, if anyone has one.
Hello, my name is Gwen, and I think this is related tangentially as it relates to the honesty of the media and the credibility of media sites. I have this theory, and I want to know if you all can troubleshoot this for me. But would there be a way that our government can establish an agency that could grade proposed news agencies not censor or change what they're saying, but at the end of a quarter or at the end of the year can give a news agency a grade. So I can look at ABC or CBS or PBS and say, oh, they scored well or not. Like I walk into a restaurant and I see, oh, they got a 98, or why did they get a 95? Or the banks are graded or accepted or not. We do this with a lot of other industries. And news, since now we have the internet, and anyone, credible or not, can put on a coat and tie and a backboard and look like a credible agency. So I don't understand why I don't hear a discussion about that.
So I think there's a real allergy to having the government grade the news media. And I think that you would not get a very good reaction to that. But I recognize the problem, which is that it's hard to know who you believe. And one of the worst things that has happened in our industry and for our democracy is the number of people who tend to believe outlets that reinforce their point of view rather than inform them, right? And part of that reflects uncertainty about who you can believe. But I guess I believe more in both the marketplace and people being able to make their own assessments about what sites they believe, and also in a greater vigilance on the part of social media sites to weed out clearly outrageously wrong, toxic, Russian-sponsored sites that have not been policed very well before. I have no problem with Russian sites not be able to portray themselves as news agencies, but I would have a real concern about the government grading news organizations.
I mean, I think just generally we're on the cusp of a we're in the brave new world, and I think a lot of the onus on funneling the real from the fake falls on social networking companies that as of right now do not think they are media companies, but in fact actually are. I mean, the question about regulation, which is really, I think, the heart of your question, is something we're still grappling with, To what degree is Facebook or is Twitter responsible for telling us what's fake and what's real? And we haven't solved that.
They should be, but they are not there yet.
Yeah, they're very reluctant.
But thank you very much for the question, and thank you all so much for being here, and thank you both.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Susan and Adrienne. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, ExxonMobil, for your generous support. And we'll see you at Harmon for Hillary Clinton.